Hello, welcome to another episode of Hidden Gems. This is the show where we take a look at a couple of classic heavy metal albums that, for whatever reason, have kind of gone underrated and overlooked over the years, and we feel deserve some more attention. So, joining me this week, as usual, is Nels, and he will kick things off.
Yeah. All right. So this time around, I picked out an album that, for me, it was a really interesting journey to get this album. It was since it's a Japanese band. At the time, it was pretty hard to get Japanese stuff over here. It was very expensive, and I had no idea what it was going to sound like. And I'm talking about The Final Day by Outrage, which I finally managed to get, and it just turned out to be an amazing album. I mean, this is the little that I knew about Outrage at the time was everyone said they kind of sounded like Metallica. In fact, some people said they sounded like the Japanese version of Metallica. And I can see the comparison, but I really don't think that it's that. They're certainly not derivative of Metallica. They certainly are by far their own sound, very thrash metal from that era. It definitely fits right into that mold. But yeah, this album in particular, this is their fourth studio album. It was recorded in Germany. They have a sort of an ongoing relationship with the drummer at the time from Accept, Stefan Kaufmann. And he was actually the producer on this album. And did a fantastic job, by the way. It's a really great sounding album for the time. But yeah, it's really, it has a lot of variety on it. Every song is heavy, every song is fast and up tempo, but there's a lot of slower parts. There's a lot of sort of atmospheric parts and sort of variety to the songwriting that's very impressive. And yeah, for me, this was just like one of those things you back in the day, you'd take a chance on, and I was really happy that I did. And to this day, I look out for Outrage material whenever I can find it, because to me, they're just one of the seminal Japanese heavy metal bands. And they've been around for a long time. I mean, this is a 1991 album. Again, their fourth album. And they've just I believe they broke up for a while, and then had a reunion that was supposed to be just a couple of shows, and have since then carried on making albums, and a lot of their newer albums are very good as well. But anyway, that's my take on I guess Outrage in general, and this album in particular. Again, back in the day, it was really hard to get Japanese stuff over here, and when you did, it was very expensive. It seems like with the internet these days, that should be a lot less of a case. But for Japan in particular, it just seems like, there's a super vibrant, mature scene of thrash and heavy metal over there that you say any of the band names to certainly people over in America and in Europe to some extent, and they're just not as well known. They're not as appreciated, and I really don't know why. By the way, they sing almost exclusively in English. So even if that's your complaint, which to me is never a complaint, I always like it when a band sings in their native language. But yeah, just sort of a lesser known band that, man, if you're a fan of thrash metal from the 90s, this is a great album. Really great.
Yeah, it's funny that a Japanese band would have to go to Germany to record an album in English.
Yeah, right.
And then sell it exclusively in Japan, pretty much.
Right. I think this album has been, I think there's 3 or 4 different versions. This obviously is the Japanese version on Polydor. I know it's been reissued a couple times. I'm not sure if any of those were outside of Japan, though. But anyway, yeah. Obviously, to me, there's a ton of bands from Japan that I really like. And all of them over here, at least, seem underappreciated. It would be really interesting to get a perspective, I think, from a Japanese fan about, these guys. My impression is they're very big over there. They they toured with when Pantera toured Japan for the first time. They were the opening band.
Oh, wow.
They do a lot of shows with some of the bigger names in metal over in Japan. Loudness, Anthem, Casbah. Just it would be really interesting to get a Japanese fans impression of how they're regarded.
Right.
Something that you
Yeah.
kind of miss over here.
Especially someone that's maybe been with them since the 80s, because
Yeah.
I'm curious to see how they evolved through, because weren't they like a trio for a while, like in the 90s?
Yeah. Yeah, and apparently, I don't have. Boy, it's funny. I have like probably like 5 or 6, maybe even more than that, of their CDs, and they've gone through musically. Definitely, there were some different phases in their careers. They had sort of a more of a almost stoner rock feel at some points, and I think that was when they were a trio as well.
Hmm.
But yeah, certainly, um, you know, as far as a band that still makes music and still puts out albums, their more recent albums are just fantastic. Like
Yes.
super heavy, super fast. Again, a lot of a variety, a lot of atmospheric stuff on there. But yeah, just all around a great band, I think, and
Yeah.
certainly probably their best album.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I've got their last two, and they're definitely really solid albums too. Much more modern production, but still, like you said, pretty diverse, and they still have their kind of thrash roots in there too.
For sure.
So it's cool to see a band that far into their career is still delivering that level of quality. One thing I was going to comment on was the vocalist. Going back and listening to this again, because I always, at the time, I remember thinking he sounded a lot like James because of the way he kind of like emphasizes certain words at the end of lines.
Yeah.
But there was a certain Danzig element to it that I was kind of picking up on too. And
Interesting.
I don't know if you noticed that at all. More like the Misfit sort of Danzig than like the the later stuff. But
it's funny to me, and this happens fairly often to me, where I will listen to a band back in the day, in the moment, and think, oh, that's totally reminds me of blah, or this singer sounds just like so and so.
Yep.
And then years later, I'll pick the album up again and listen to it, and I'll go, what the heck was I thinking? These guys are original. This is it is in that genre. Maybe that was it. Maybe back in the day, the thrash metal as a genre was certainly much narrower than it is now. And
right.
Maybe the influences just came through stronger back in the day, or maybe, I don't know. Maybe I've changed and my hearing has changed, but yeah, these guys to me just sound really original. And certainly I remember thinking the James comparisons, Hetfield, and there's a lot more of that on there. I don't have both or all three of their earlier albums. I only have two of them, but there's definitely more of a Metallica influence, I think, on the albums before this.
Okay. Yeah.
Even those albums, boy, I'm gonna get the names wrong. Black Clouds and the name escapes me. Even those, when I listen to them now, I think, oh yeah, this is thrash metal, and clearly they've heard Bay Area thrash, but it doesn't strike me in any way as a copy or anything like that. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and on the final day, there was a couple songs that I thought were really different for a thrash band. Trying to remember the names here: River and Veiled Sky.
Yeah,
so they both kind of have, like, especially River has kind of a folk, almost folk kind of influence to it at times. And it also reminded me a lot, when the guitars do kick in, it reminded me a lot of like the kind of classic Y&T and Scorpions stuff from the early 80s. And you just don't hear that on a lot of thrash albums,
Yeah. And certainly in some of the research I did reading up for this, they claim their early influences were new wave of British heavy metal stuff. But Also, I think that's one of those sorts of contrasts that you get, the sort of unusual mixtures of, like you said, this sounds almost kind of folky, but then it's in a really heavy, fast song. Those kind of contrasts, coming from a band where culturally they're outside of my experience, to me that's really interesting, and I think it lends to the album. It makes it kind of more interesting, and it just has stuff that you wouldn't expect. Combinations like that, contrasts, and this is definitely one of those albums. But I like that. I think that's great. It, certainly, that won't always work to you. Sometimes the contrasts are jarring or different to your ear, but I think for the most part, Outrage really makes that work.
Yeah, Veiled Sky is like, it's the song that's like, it's almost like a ballad or something. And then when it kicks in, it's just like
It's
one of the heaviest
really,
songs on the album.
yeah, and super fast.
Holy crap.
Yeah, those contrasts are just beautiful, and the way that they're recorded and mixed, super effective. I mean, it doesn't sound like a modern recording. This definitely sounds like a recording from '91, but it's really good.
Yeah, it's held up pretty well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's not underground feeling at all. It's just, it sounds like an album from '91.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how I first heard Outrage. I think it was probably because I had a couple pen pals in Japan who would send me
Yeah,
those, and I think they sent me a tape with like Casbah and United and Outrage and
Jurassic Jade and
Jurassic Jade. Yeah,
yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I think it was one of those tapes that you got, that was like, oh, all of a sudden these names that were totally not on my radar, because
yeah,
even the heavy metal press didn't cover them very much, at least the Western heavy metal press. But yeah, I think it was from one of your pen pals sending a tape, and it was like, all of a sudden now I have this list.
right.
And to this day, there's still, bands that I think of from that time. Casbah, certainly one, Jurassic Jade, that, man, if the material were over here released, and again, I'm talking about physical media because that's something that I enjoy, I would just buy a ton of it. And as it is, I have to kind of be careful and picky, because it's still hard to get stuff sent to you from Japan. It takes forever. And it tends to be very expensive. So
Yeah, the media itself is expensive. The shipping's expensive.
yeah, and again, usually it's on an album that you really aren't familiar with, and so you're taking a little bit of a leap of faith. Obviously, in the modern day, you can find a lot of that stuff on the internet and listen to it ahead of time. Casbah is a really good example of that. I recently picked up one of their more recent albums, and it's fantastic and very original. Has a really mix of sort of hardcore feeling and thrash metal, and anyway.
That's another show.
Yeah, indeed.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to talk about my choice for this week, which is Dio's Strange Highways. And
great album.
yeah, this was one that came out like right after the Dehumanizer reunion with Black Sabbath fell apart. In fact, it came out like just barely a year after Dehumanizer did, which is kind of amazing because
that is really.
They toured pretty extensively for Dehumanizer, and then like that fell apart at the very end, and then he managed to put together pretty much. I mean, it's not a new band. It's still Vinny Appice on drums, but you got Jeff Pilson in on bass and a new guitarist, Tracy G, and came out with this album that this was '93, so a lot of the classic metal bands were really struggling to kind of find their way at this point. Priest had lost Halford, Maiden had lost Dickinson. Everybody was either kind of going for a grunge sound, like all the hair metal bands that were trying to survive were kind of like, dressing in flannel and trying to adapt. And some of the classic heavy metal bands were just breaking up or just, kind of taking a step back for a while. But Dio, I think, adapted better than a lot of them, because like this album is definitely, it's definitely got a darker, harder edge than the 80s material, but
Mhm.
at the heart of the songs, like they're still definitely Dio songs, and like his writing style for the lyrics, even though he deals with a lot more like realistic subjects on it, it's still like done in a very poetic way that, you know, he's always managed to pull off like really well. So yeah, I just think it's like a lot of people kind of just write it off because it's like, oh, it doesn't sound like a classic Dio album, and it's got this, you know, the guitars are a little bit off-putting, I could see, because Tracy G's style is definitely a lot more like angular, and just, you know, uses a lot of weird effects. And you're more of a guitarist, you might have some better insight into what excuse me, what he's doing. But it's the kind of thing that like wouldn't really, I don't see it really working so well with like the earlier Dio material, but like it somehow actually really works with this stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think, you know, again, it's a case of not trying to imitate your past material, realizing that, hey, this is a new band and there's going to be a little bit of a new sound to it, but it's still Dio, right? It's, I mean, that voice just,
Yes.
and like you said, the writing, he was a great lyricist. I mean, the stuff that he would come up with, and then, you know, him singing it, of course, helps out any lyrics, I would imagine. But for sure. And again, I appreciate that when people try something new, because it's risky from a career standpoint. And it's, you know, are my old fans going to like this? But yeah, to me, it really worked really well. And it's heavy. It's not like a sellout or anything like that. It's I thought it was a really good direction for Dio at the time, and still I like that album.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny what like a sellout is considered, because like in the 80s it was always like, you know, you went like in a lighter, poppier direction, maybe threw some keyboards in there, you know, stuff like Mystery and Hungry for Heaven. It's like,
Well, yeah,
those seemed a little bit like, you know, a nod to like the radio. But
right.
in the 90s, you know, bands like Pantera were huge, and so a lot of times bands were actually trying to be heavier than they were before, but
Right.
not always that successfully.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you know, Dio is somebody who was a great musician, but also was a very active promoter and you know, commercial. He realized what it took to sell records, and I feel like he went out of his way to write a single for each, pretty much each album,
Mm-hmm.
and to have that be something that was a little bit more radio friendly. And that, you know, I think that's just the reality of, hey, I want my stuff to sell. I want to make another album next year, blah, blah, blah. So I feel like Dio he's a businessman, in addition to being just a fantastic musician. And so there is some of that, I think, you know, Rainbow in the Dark and whatever, the sort of poppier, more radio friendly songs that he would do on his albums. But yeah, to me, it was never like that's the only thing that he does.
This album also reminds me, because the song structures are a little bit more like not so straightforward as some of the earlier albums, and that kind of reminded me of Dehumanizer, actually.
Interesting.
Because I mean, Dehumanizer, if you listen to that compared to like the, you know, Heaven and Hell, Mob Rules, it's definitely heavier. There's some darker lyrics, you know, a little bit more reality-based lyrics.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's there's kind of a thread between that album and this album too.
Interesting. Yeah.
A lot of people don't, because I mean, Dehumanizer is, you know, it's kind of an underrated album itself, but at the same time, I think it's kind of gained a lot of popularity as time goes on, as people look back, and it's like, yeah, that was a really, you know, great album.
Yeah, that is a great album too. And I think probably, again, if you were in the context of the moment compared to looking back at it now, it probably has a very different effect on people. But yeah, definitely, that's a great album, a good hidden gem album.
Yeah. the weird thing to me is that they went from this album to Angry Machines, which I've gone
Right.
back and listened to every so often, and in hopes that it'll at some point, like, stick with me. But it's like everything that could have gone wrong with Strange Highways, I feel like did with Angry
Right.
Machines. Like the songs just weren't quite there. The lyrics were just not his best work. There's something weird with the production and mix on that album where things just don't gel.
Yeah, everything's a little bit abrasive. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
um, it yeah, it's not either as finely polished or well put together, or they're pushing the limits just a little bit too much in certain ways. But I totally agree. It just didn't come together and make for the, a good listening experience. Usually it's a little more challenging, even though there's good material on it.
yeah. There are some good songs.
And once again, they have Dio singing. So,
Man, yeah, his voice.
oh man.
I mean, on this album in particular, like I feel like you can really hear like the frustration and anger of the breakup with Sabbath again, because like the song
Interesting.
"Pain,"
That's
like, he
interesting.
just, oh man, he just really lets it out. Anytime people ask me like, who's your favorite all time heavy metal singer, or singer in general, but
Yeah.
it's always like Rob Halford or Ronnie James Dio, and it
Right.
always depends on like who I've listened to the most recently, because they're
Yeah.
both
Right.
so
Right.
different and so good.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember there's a great quote, and I think it's from an interview that's on like the Heaven and Hell live DVD where they're interviewing somebody. And he says Dio's voice could have an otherworldly sadness to it. And I think, that amount of emotion that Dio puts into his delivery and communicates effectively is pretty unique.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of why the lyrics, like, really stick with me too, because it's like he writes these like somewhat obscure lyrics, but they still, and I think part of it is the way he delivers them. It creates this world in each
Yeah.
song that you become a part of. That's like, I don't know, it just doesn't happen with a lot of songs for me. Like, I'm not a big lyric guy. I appreciate good lyrics, but a lot of times
Right.
it's like if the music is good enough,
Yes.
whatever. But with Dio, it's just like it really does transport you.
Yeah. Certainly one of the all-time greats, and definitely one of my all-time favorite singers.
The production on this album is another thing that I think was kind of unique for Dio. He worked with Mike Frazier,
Oh,
who's mostly done like engineering and mixing work for like everybody from like AC/DC and Aerosmith to like Primal Fear and Satyricon, like more modern, like extreme metal bands.
Interesting.
But he actually produced and engineered and I think mixed this album. And Dio, if you look at all of the other Dio albums, like they're pretty much all produced by Dio himself.
Mm-hmm.
I think Lock Up the Wolves he co-produced with Tony Platt, who's not my favorite producer, and maybe that's why that's not my favorite Dio album. But
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting choice, and it actually worked really well. Like if you listen to this album, it's like the bass on it is just like really present, and everything is just mixed together like perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think that's there's a certain school of thought that you don't want to overproduce your album, but I think there's this concept for me of just getting the right separation to the instruments. They're all real clear, but you can actually hear each one individually, but then they work again as a mix. And to me, that's good production. I guess if you can't get Martin Birch, then at least come up with really clear, concise mixes.
And maybe it's because Mike Frazier is mostly, I mean, like mixing and engineering is like kind of his forte. So like having him as the producer is like he's got that in mind the whole time when they're recording too.
That's a good point. I think if you're really concentrating on the recording quality a lot, probably then having the individual tracks stand out and having them as well as play well together with the mix that's probably a whole different angle to it than a lot of producers have.
The last thing I was going to comment on was just the cover artwork. Because looking back at Dio's albums, like that's actually one thing that's been pretty consistent. Is like he's always had like, you know, very colorful, very vivid, usually like painted album covers. Like he never, like a lot of bands in the 90s, they went for these like, you know, kind of cheaper, thrown together looking Photoshop messes. And
Right.
even all through, you know, even Angry Machines, you know, I don't love the cover, but it's like, it's a well put together, you know, painted cover. And this is another one that's just like, I mean, you think of the title Strange Highways and it's like, okay, that could go in so many different directions. And this is not one I would have thought of, but it's actually a pretty cool cover.
Do you know if he was he consistently working with an artist to do the covers, or?
Man, that's a good question.
Probably not, just because they tend to be kind of some variety, but
right.
I remember Holy Diver, that just seeing that cover for the first time and just being blown away. I mean, it's a pretty jarring image when you first see it, and you know, I wasn't necessarily sure what the music was going to sound like. Obviously, I was a big Sabbath fan, but yeah, that cover I thought was iconic. Very, very nice.
All right. Well, I think that does it for another episode of Hidden Gems. If you guys like this, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel, and maybe leave some comments what you think about Strange Highways, what you think about Final Day. And if you haven't heard either album, definitely go and check them out.
Yeah, or you know, if there's other hidden gems that you feel are really overlooked, man, we'd love to hear about that too.
Yeah, for sure. So until next time, this is Dan and Nels and signing off. So have a good one.
Yeah.